Former candidate for the U.S. Senate, longtime radio talk show host, author, and conservative policy advocate.
Justices to the Supreme Court, the left has been in open panic.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
James Comey tried to take down a president, but he walks free for now. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and broadcast from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. The disgraced former FBI director is condemned but not indicted. Did the punishment or lack thereof fit the crime or lack thereof? We'll dive into that, plus LibertyNation.com national correspondent Joe Schaeffer will weigh in on the Democrats' presidential race, the rise of one candidate posing the most serious challenge to frontrunner Joe Biden, plus Biden's latest electability strategy. Spoiler alert, he's clinging to Obama. And LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor Scott Cosenza jumps on board for Talkin Liberty, featuring cops using photoshopped images, plus whether Christian videographers can be compelled to shoot gay weddings. So the special counsel aimed directly at the heart of President Trump for 2 years wound up firing blanks, failing to even establish a conspiracy with Russia, not to mention Trump masterminding one, a conspiracy which was proclaimed as a certainty by the left and their handmaidens in the elite media for months on end. But this week, we were given an official explanation of something we already knew about what triggered that scandalous episode. A leak by the now infamous and thoroughly disgraced James Comey after he was shown the door by Trump as FBI director. This week, the first part of an internal Justice Department investigation by Inspector General Michael Horowitz was released, delivering a stinging indictment of Comey going rogue or going off the deep end, and releasing a memo to a professor friend of his with instructions to release it to the media in hopes of triggering a special counsel, which is exactly what happened. But Comey escaped indictment, at least for now, while demonstrating afresh his spectacular narcissism that makes Trump look like a shrinking violet. He actually had the chutzpah, Comey did, to send out a tweet asking for an apology from his accusers. This after the IG report condemned Comey for violating government rules, concealing information from his former agency, leaking sensitive documents without authorization, mismarking memos without classification banners, improperly retaining records in an unsecured location, failing to surrender those records to the FBI, and usurping authority he did not have, which, of course, is exactly what Comey also did in the Hillary Clinton email investigation, when he made a spectacle of himself by effectively assuming the role of attorney general and judge and jury. Here's the language from the IG report. Quote, Comey's characterization of the memos as personal records finds no support in the law and is wholly incompatible with the plain language of the statutes, regulations, and policies defining federal records and the terms of Comey's FBI employment agreements, unquote. Now, all the evidence you need of Comey's intent to destroy the Trump presidency came when he sat down with George Stephanopoulos of ABC News after all of this and said he never even told President Trump about the fact that the dirt on him which triggered the Mueller investigation, including the story of urinating on a bed in Moscow that President Obama had once slept in, was bankrolled by the Hillary Clinton campaign.
Did you tell him that the Steele dossier had been financed by his political opponents?
No, I didn't even think I used the term Steele dossier. I just talked about additional material.
But did he have a right to know that?
That had been financed by his political opponents? I don't know the answer to that. It wasn't necessary for my goal, which was to alert him that we had this information. Honestly, never thought these words would come out of my mouth, but I don't know whether the current president of the United States was with prostitutes peeing on each other in Moscow in 2013. It's possible, but I don't know.
It's possible? It's possible? You see what he did there? He takes a ridiculous, scurrilous allegation and says, sure, it's possible. The weasel. What does that mean? Well, a weasel is a sneaky and sly person. Your weasel of a friend has a habit of, for example, forgetting his wallet every time he goes out to dinner with you. You can call someone who cheats and lies a weasel. That's James Comey. Now, talk about possible. It's possible. It's possible. This man, Comey, has actually succeeded in doing something that's almost impossible. He's made enemies of everyone in Washington. The left, after he usurped authority in the Clinton email investigation. The right, after he went on a personal vendetta to destroy Trump by any means available. He's now disgraced and left essentially for dead. A hollowed out, shrunken shell of a man once thought to be a paragon of integrity, but now, like so many others in the Trump era, unmasked as the worst kind of craven, megalomaniacal D.C. swamp creature. And you know, Comey's not in the clear yet. Hardly. The Inspector General is focused on those FISA warrants, and Comey is right in the middle of that. So one would suspect that we haven't heard the last of this man, James Comey, who decided to take the fate of the republic and a duly elected president he despises into his own hands, and came frighteningly close to succeeding, to taking down the President of the United States. We'll take a quick break, then come back to discuss Democratic presidential politics.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
So James Comey escapes indictment, for now at least. Democrats prepare for their third round of debates next month with one candidate seemingly on the rise and threatening the current frontrunner. Trump derangement syndrome continues to spread unabated. Joining us to weigh in on all this is LibertyNation.com national correspondent Joe Schaeffer. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's always a pleasure. So let's start with James Comey. He told the president, quote, "I don't do sneaky things. I don't leak. I don't do weasel moves," unquote. Just as he was preparing to leak details of his private conversation with the president, which he set up for the express purpose of getting dirt that he then released to a professor with instructions to leak it to the media in hopes of triggering a special counsel investigation. And now he's condemned in the Inspector General report, but there won't be an indictment. So do you think the lack of an indictment was only because recommending one would appear to be simply retribution against the president's political opponents?
You know, I'm not sure what the motivations there were, but what I think everyone agrees on is that Comey is way out of line claiming that he's been vindicated in some way by this. He is not out of the water at all. The Inspector General Horowitz found that he violated bureau policy. He's taking memos home. He's leaking them to the press. And it's not over for him. Devin Nunes says that he's got some good groundwork here to continue the investigation. They're going to go after Comey for FISA violations. So for him to claim vindication is just as ridiculous as everything they did during that whole Trump-Russia circus to begin with.
All right, let's talk Democratic presidential primary. We'll skip the Republicans for a while, even though Joe Walsh, not the musician, but a former congressman, has entered the fray against President Trump on the Republican side. But on the Democratic side, you've got now about 20 candidates now that Kirsten Gillibrand has regrettably dropped out of the race. But let's talk turkey in terms of the people who can actually win this thing, while most every other candidate from Biden to the bottom of the pack has seemed to either be running in place or losing ground. Pocahontas, Senator Elizabeth Warren, has been on the rise. She famously has a plan for everything, Joe. Do you think it's the specific, albeit radical, policy she keeps putting out that is producing this rise, or is she just outworking and out-strategizing the others?
I don't think it's anything she's doing, to tell you the truth. The Democrats know they need someone to emerge. We were talking about Warren last fall, just how horrible a candidate she was even before this thing began. And I didn't think she'd be anywhere near the top as she is now. But it's more that the Democrats need somebody. It's nothing she's doing to stand out. I do think that the groundwork is going well for her now because it's turning more towards policy. Gillibrand dropping out is kind of a signal that even Democrats have had it up to here with the pandering, the reality TV show stunts, and it hides Warren's faults for her to focus on policy.
Our guest here on Liberty Nation Radio is Joe Schaeffer, national correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Let's turn our focus, Joe, to Kamala Harris, who is the big story in the first debate when she went after Joe Biden on the issue of race and busing, of all things, which was about 90% unpopular in the 1970s. But Kamala has failed to gain any ground since that first debate. What's her problem?
Her problem is I don't think she has much to offer. We're seeing, hopefully, Democrats moving away from, like I said, this pandering on racial issues and identity politics. But as I wrote in an article this week, I think it hurts two of the so-called top-tier Dems. I think Kamala Harris definitely is top-tier. Pete Buttigieg is close to top-tier, but I don't think he is. But I think both of them are hurt by a move towards a substantive policy debate. As I said, it helps Warren. I think it helps Bernie Sanders because he's terrible when he starts talking about that. But Harris is playing kind of this neat game where she's always bringing up race. She's always like busing and all these other things. She's always defining who is and who isn't a racist. But she's trying to position herself as the person who's above all this at the same time that she's constantly throwing it in everybody's face.
Right. Well, she's got a basic problem, which is squaring her record as an aggressive prosecutor who put a lot of people in jail with her rhetoric as a social justice warrior. It doesn't align properly, and I think that's been a big part of the problem she's had getting above the 6 or 7% threshold.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think it's just another sign that she really doesn't have a lot to talk about.
Unlike Elizabeth Warren, who has a lot to say, the question is whether that's palatable to the American people. But Kamala Harris, as you said, has been kind of an empty vessel over these last few weeks, sort of lurching back and forth between various positions and saying, one of the things that I think is very revealing, the number of times that Kamala Harris answers a question about a tough issue by saying, we need to have a conversation about that. Oh, please, come on. This is a presidential primary. Here's where you have the conversation right now. But let's turn over to Joe Biden for a second, because he's still well ahead in the polls, although he struggles in those first states of Iowa and New Hampshire. Biden and his wife Jill, or Dr. Jill Biden, as they demand that you call her, have been pushing electability. They ran out a spot, a big TV ad in Iowa saying basically, forget about policy. We've got to beat Trump. And Lunch Bucket Joe's the only one who can pull it off. Have you ever witnessed before a presidential candidate do that, tout only their electability? And then, Joe, what happens if his poll numbers go down? What does he hang on to then?
I think he's a phony candidate. He's a phony lead candidate, that's for sure. These polls are mostly name recognition. And what he reminds me of, I don't know if it's a perfect comparison, he reminds me of Hillary in 2016.
Yeah.
in that he is the establishment machine establishment candidate. She was running basically on I'm inevitable. And with her, it was, I have the power to get this nomination. You can't stop me.
Right.
So Democrats, you have to vote for me because I'm inevitable. And Biden's sort of doing the same thing in a different way. He's saying, you want to beat Trump, it's got to be me. Nobody else can do it. It has to be me. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think he's right that these other Democratic candidates would be terrible against Trump. But that does not mean that he is going to be a successful candidate against Trump. So I agree with you. He has really nothing to say except for, I'm inevitable. It's got to be me. I'm the only one. And, his gaffes, his he sort of reminds me of, again, with Hillary had serious health concerns, as we all remember from 2016, with her shaking and coughing. That did serious damage to her.
And collapsing at that September 11th event. Let's not forget that. That was a red alert for the voters. But it seems to me, Joe, that what Joe Biden is doing is providing essentially a third alternative in this election. You have Trumpism, which is quite obvious what that is. You have the socialists in the Democratic Party who want to go radically in the other direction from capitalism to socialism. And then you have Joe Biden sort of a third way saying, let's just go back to the good old days of Biden and Obama. And I'll just soothe the savage beast. We'll calm things down and we'll get back to normal. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
That is Joe Schaeffer, national correspondent for LibertyNation.com. Stay right there, because we're coming back with our signature segment, Say What?
Say what? Say what? One more time.
It is time for our signature segment, Say What?, where we roll out some of the most wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing statements uttered by politicians and the chattering class. And I got to tell you, we've got a soundbite so filled with hate and rage against the machine that is Donald Trump that it's literally breathtaking. And we'll get to it. But first, the frontrunner in the Democratic presidential race seems to have made a key decision on how to win the nomination. Joe Biden has decided to trash any real discussion of actual issues in favor of touting the single issue of his electability. The former vice president launched a full frontal assault on how he's the only one who can beat Trump, first by sending his wife, Dr. Jill, out to New Hampshire to say her guy is the one.
You may like another candidate better, but you have to look at who is going to win. Your candidate might be better on, health care than Joe is. But you've got to look at who's going to win this election. And maybe you have to swallow a little bit and say, okay, I sort of personally like so-and-so better. But your bottom line has to be that we have to beat Trump.
Yeah, forget about the issues. This guy can win. Don't worry about what he says about your favorite issues. So after the wife made the electability pitch, Biden put up an ad doubling down.
We know in our bones this election is different. The stakes are higher, the threat more serious. We have to beat Donald Trump. And all the polls agree Joe Biden is the strongest Democrat to do the job.
God, that voice. Talk about voice of God. But Biden is also trying to set himself apart from the pack in another way. Healthcare. Defending Obamacare in another ad against both Trump and the Medicare for All advocates in his own party running against him, employing his own most personal stories.
I was sworn into the United States Senate next to a hospital bed. My wife and daughter had been killed in a car crash. And lying in that bed were my two surviving little boys. I couldn't imagine what it would have been like if we didn't have the health care they needed immediately. 40 years later, one of those little boys, my son Bo, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Health care is personal to me. Obamacare is personal to me. When I see the president try to tear it down and others propose to replace it and start over, that's personal to me too.
See, that's the problem. It's personal to him. We don't want to have people with a personal, emotional attachment to an issue making policy, passing laws about that issue. Now, you wouldn't put a victim of rape in charge of determining the sentence for the person who raped her. Extreme example, yes, but it makes the point. And I'm not exactly sure people will want to vote for someone just because they feel sorry for him or her, especially when he keeps making embarrassing gaffes like this latest one.
We have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
Not a good look when you're trying desperately to be woke, Joe. Of course, Biden's now started using rhetoric every bit as heated as Trump, starting with his rollout video based on the lie that Trump called white supremacists very fine people. So one wonders whether he's not being drawn into the same trap as little Marco Rubio or Lion Ted Cruz, trying to sling mud against the master and turning themselves into cartoon characters in the process. Of course, in Biden's case, he was already a cartoon character. All this while Lunch Bucket Joe pleads for a return to civility. Right. And all those gaffes beg again the lingering question of Biden's age, 78 upon inauguration, or more precisely, whether he's, shall we say, lost a step or two or more. So one of the ways the elite media's try to draw attention away from Biden's stumbling and bumbling is to call in deranged psychiatrists, there's an oxymoron, to say Donald Trump is unrelentingly sick and evil. Both of the most Trump-deranged networks weighed in on MSNBC. It was Dr. Lance Dodds, not Dodo, Dodds, who depicts Trump and his followers as essentially a cult.
He thinks of himself in the way a tyrant acts, and he acts like a tyrant. It's all about him. So the people who follow him are people who buy into the idea that he is God, but they're being conned by him.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if you thought that was bad on MSNBC, CNN called in their own left-wing Trump-deranged shrink, Alan Francis, chairman of the psychiatry department at Duke University Medical School. And hold your breath and listen to what he says, starting with the claim by people on his own side that Trump is mentally ill, and then driving right off the cliff.
It stigmatizes the mentally ill. I've known thousands of patients. Almost all of them have been well-behaved, well-mannered, good people. Trump is none of these. Lumping the mentally ill with Trump is a terrible insult to the mentally ill. Calling Trump crazy hides the fact that we're crazy for having elected him. Trump is as destructive a person in this century as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao were in the last century. He may be responsible for many more million deaths than they were.
You know, if I told you a guy actually said that on national television, you wouldn't believe me. So, for those of you not listening attentively to the unrestrained hate and rage and derangement of that statement from the chairman of the psychiatry department at a major American university, I'll play it again. Now, just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you. Quick break, and then we're back with Talkin Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
And now it is time to welcome back our regular contributor, constitutional lawyer, LibertyNation.com, legal affairs editor, podcast director, and chief cook and bottle washer at LibertyNation.com, Scott Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
Hello, Tim. How are you?
Every week, the chain of titles gets longer.
Yes.
But lest we bore our interested listeners right off the radio or online, let's go right to the videotape, as Warner Wolf used to say. Back page, federal prosecutors lied, asserting opposite of what they knew was true, meaning what?
That the prosecutors who have railed against the Backpage website and its operators as being people who are basically guilty of trafficking children as sexual slaves. The exact opposite is true. They were aides to law enforcement in rescuing children who were being trafficked and did everything they could to make sure that that wasn't the case. Tim, right from the FBI agent's report, quote, unlike virtually every other website that is used for prostitution and sex trafficking, Backpage is remarkably responsive to law enforcement requests and often takes proactive steps to assist in investigations. So this is Backpage was one of the top 500 websites in the country, Tim, when the FBI seized it under the pretext that it was being used for illegal child sex trafficking.
What is Backpage.com as it's presented to the public?
Well, what it was before it was seized was a classifieds website that had all sorts of classified ads, from you could sell a lawnmower to a car, but was chiefly used for the sale of commercial sex by adults to other adults. That couldn't be abided, though, and we have, just like Tim, I think there's an insufficient quantity of white supremacists in the country for progressives, so they have to create.
Scott, there's the Ku Klux Klan has 7,000 members in the United States.
They couldn't even fill one Vegas hotel with every Klan member in the country, Tim. It's ridiculous. And that's actually a high estimate, by the way. 3,000 is a more conservative.
Okay, I've heard anything from 3,000 to 7,000 in the Ku Klux Klan, but of course the left will say, oh, they've just moved on to start other organizations.
So they've had to create.
So there's no point.
They've had to create them in order to sort of continue up their crusade. And the same is true with child sex trafficking. It's a celebratory moment. Fortunately, there isn't that much child sex trafficking, and to the extent that there is, Backpage has nothing to do with it. But it became a great target for prosecutors who are political actors. Kamala Harris made her way to the U.S. Senate on the back of criticizing Backpage, and the founders of that company are now in the dock in Arizona awaiting criminal trial next year.
Doctored images have become that much more common on the internet these days. People photoshopping stuff, putting it up to attack or smear other people or make it seem that there's something that they're not.
And deep fakes coming too.
And deep fakes. But police departments using photoshopped images for criminal identification lineups is not something you would expect to see, but apparently in Portland, Oregon, that's what they're doing.
It's pretty shocking. I think we really need to stay on top of, Tim, these photo manipulation and video manipulation cases, because in the future, how are we going to be able to tell evidence, when evidence is presented, if it's genuine or not? I don't know if you saw in the news this week, there was the Jordan Peterson website issue. That somebody had created a website that was called Not Jordan Peterson. And you could type words into it, and it would sound like Jordan Peter was saying those words. But, of course, he wasn't, and they shut that down. Well, the police in Portland wanted to basically implicate this man called Tyrone Allen in a bank robbery crime. The problem was Mr. Allen had facial tattoos, and the witness to the robbery didn't report any facial tattoos. So when they did, when they did the photo array lineup, they airbrushed out his tattoos, and sure enough, he gets picked. Well, guess what? That seems awfully fast and loose with identification. We don't yet know, Tim, whether the courts in Oregon, whether the state courts or the federal circuit courts will declare this unconstitutional. It has been challenged, and we're awaiting a ruling now to see if it will be held as legal or not, this kind of manipulation.
How can it be legal? How could it be ruled that it is legal if the police are manipulating pictures, whether it's a lot or a little? If they go down the road of manipulating pictures, what comes next?
It's a slippery slope, and given the future of, well, actually, I shouldn't even say the future, given the present of what's capable in terms of photo manipulation, right? You may say, okay, well, if you take off a tattoo, that's obvious. What if you add a mustache or a beard? What if you lengthen or shorten hair? I agree that it's most troublesome and should be ruled unconstitutional, but we'll have to see.
The point is, you can't
it's
present
offered,
it as fact.
In this case, it's offered for the purpose of implicating that person in the crime, but it's not actually a photo of that person. So, it's hard to see how it will pass muster, but the police in Portland think it will, and so do the prosecutors there.
Now, the battle over what people can be forced to do against their religious beliefs continues. It's taken place mostly in tiny, obscure bakeries dotted across mostly the western U.S., and now it's moved on to videographers who have a First Amendment right not to make same-sex wedding videos, according to the Eighth Circuit.
You know, when I read the story, I thought of you, Tim, because for people who don't know, you and your wife for a long time operate a boutique video production company.
I thought you were going to say I was part of a same-sex marriage.
No.
The way you sort of aligned that together there, I wasn't sure.
A boutique video production company that aligned with your religious values, oftentimes, and political values. And I'm sure that those were thoughtful choices. And if somebody came in and said, we'd like you to produce a Satan-worshiping video, for instance, or one that, lionized collectivism or something like that, you would say, no, we don't want your money. Thank you. Go somewhere else. We're not interested in that kind. We're not going to put our efforts behind that. And that's what happened here. Carl and Angela Larson, they make wedding videos, and they wish to not do so for homosexual marriages. And they say that their First Amendment right to not be compelled to speak through the art of their video production guarantees them the right to not have to do that. And thankfully, I think it was a 2-1 decision, but that's what the court said. I'm losing my place as to what what circuit it was in. It was the Eighth Circuit. Excuse me.
Eighth Circuit.
So that's what the Eighth Circuit said. So that's the rule right now in the Eighth Circuit only. It could be the rule in other of the judicial circuits, but we don't know. Currently, the case on point here is the Masterpiece Cake Shop case out of Colorado, but that case yielded no bright line ruling or precedent that we can rely on because the Colorado Human Rights Commission was so bigoted against the religiosity of the Masterpiece Cake Shop owner that the Supreme Court said, well, we can't even rule on whether or not it's a First Amendment issue because they discriminated against him because of his religion. So really the nuts and bolts of it is that this case may, in fact, go to the Supreme Court. We have to see. Surely there will be a split in the circuits at some point. This issue will go to the Supreme Court, and they will have to rule whether or not the First Amendment requires states to be hands-off with their must-work rules for homosexuals.
A split in the circuits, for those uninitiated, means that different circuit courts come up with different rulings, which means it would have to ultimately be settled by the Supreme Court. There is no higher court in the land. Just to put a finer point on it, in many ways, what you described for me, which is, let's say a Satan-worshiping video that we would have to produce, or let's say one that is lauding Adolf Hitler, and you ask a Jewish videographer to put that together.
Or any human being that understands what Adolf Hitler did.
In a sense, you can't. It's not even possible for somebody to do that because of the artistic imperative, which we've talked about frequently, that requires someone to understand and at least sympathize, if not empathize, with the subject. It's not even possible. So the forcing people to do it.
You could also say that I can't put out the quality of the product that I want. In other words, I'm not willing to put my name behind that production, irrespective of the content, because I'm against that content. I won't be able to actually produce something that this company can be proud of, which is what we're about. You're actually denigrating the name of the company then.
That's what it comes down to. That's exactly what I was saying. Now, California's top court finally is allowing law enforcement agencies to share a list of problem cops with prosecutors. And the problem with this is...
union rules, Tim, which is, I think, perhaps the biggest stumbling block to a situation in America where the people and the police have some kind of detente, and we don't have this continual friction where so many people feel put upon and set upon by the police, and the police in turn feel like they're occupiers. In other words, that they're not respected at all by the community, and that they're putting their lives on the line for that community. What happens is you have these horrible cops that aren't disciplined, and they're allowed to remain on the force. It's a cancer that eats away. And if you're, how many interactions do they have to have with the public before the public gets sullied against all the other officers?
Well, the people who should be against this type of action or lack of action against dirty cops, crooked cops, violent cops who go over the line should be other cops, because it ruins it for the rest of them. They get painted with a broad brush, and the left is on that case big time, as we know.
So the LA County sheriffs wanted to send this list of 300 problematic deputies to prosecutors so that they could disclose their problems to defense and not have bad cases go to court. But the union, Tim, their union sued to make sure that they weren't released. And this case resolves that dispute and says absolutely that it is legal for the department to go ahead and forward those names. And what I was going to say is so much of the friction, Tim, is because of these union contracts. It's the reason why you'll see it takes so long, for instance, for Eric Garner's killer to be fired, okay, or a cop who is fired with seemingly good cause, but then you read about a year and a half later he's hired back at full back pay and benefits. How is that? Well, because of the union contract that the city signed. And unfortunately, it's just a feature of a municipal union that there is no strong advocate on the other side of the bargaining table saying, well, hey, let's make sure that these bargaining requirements are a little bit more in favor of the people because they're not voting or donating like the police officers are and the union representatives.
Okay, we're out of time. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, where past is prologue. They're all available at LibertyNation.com, on demand, and, of course, from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, but we'll be back at you next week. Same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying stand up for liberty, and we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.